Today we will be talking about operations with functions, which includes composition of functions. So for an operation with a function, you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide functions. So if we have f of x equals 3x minus 7 and g of x equals 13 minus 2x, we want to add the two functions together. So we will take f of x, 3x minus 7, and add it to 13 minus 2x. So in this case, you're going to combine your like terms. So 3x minus 2x gives me x, and then negative 7 plus 13 gives me a positive 6. So x plus 6 is my solution when I add f of x plus g of x. So the new function is denoted using f plus g of x. You can also write it as f of x plus g of x, which typically I like better because in my head it makes more sense. However, it works for whichever way you'd like to do it. So if I wanted to subtract functions, I would do f of x minus g of x. And if I wanted to multiply two functions together, f of x times, that's a times, g of x. And dividing functions, f of x divided by g of x, granted that g of x is not 0. So we're gonna do some examples here with f of x, g of x, and h of x here, and we're going to find the functions, and then we're going to talk about the domain of the function, the new function we created. So for number 1, we have f plus g of x, so we're going to take f of x, which is x squared, minus 8x plus 4, and I'm going to add it to g of x, which is 4x minus 3. So I'm going to combine my like terms, but in this case I don't have any x squareds, so they stay the same. Negative 8x plus 4x gives me a negative 4x, and 4 minus 3 gives me a positive 1. And my domain for this thing, so this is just a parabola. So the domain for a parabola is all real numbers. And I'm just going to stick with the odd numbers so we don't have to do all of these gigantic things. So 3, I'm going to multiply h and g. So I'm going to have h, which is x plus 2. It's always important to write it in the order that it shows you to, because when you get into addition and subtraction, the order does matter, more for subtraction than addition. And then g of x, 4x minus 3, and I'm going to multiply them together. So I'm going to FOIL. 4x times x gives me 4x squared. X times negative 3 gives me negative 3x. 4x times 2 gives me 8x. And then 2 times negative 3 gives me negative 6. So 4x squared plus 5x minus 6. And the domain for this thing, it's also a parabola. So the domain for this thing is also all real numbers. It will not always be all real numbers, but 9 times out of 10 it will be. So when we're dividing h divided by g of x, I can tell you this one won't be all real numbers. So h is x plus 2. And g is 4x minus 3. And I can't simplify anything there. Don't try to cross out any x's or anything like that. So that would be my solution. And my domain, well, what would make my denominator 0? So 4x minus 3 equal to 0. 4x equals 3, so x equals 3/4. So x cannot be 3/4 because that would be what would make my denominator 0. So moving on. we got new functions now. We have f of x is 2x squared minus x minus 12, and g of x is x plus 7. So adding these two, but the difference is here, if I wanted to add these two together, I got a negative 2 this time instead of just an x. So I could add them together with the x's first, but that's a lot more work. So we're going to do f of negative 2. So that means I'm going to substitute negative 2 in for every x that I see in f. So 2 times negative 2 squared minus a negative 2 minus 12. So negative 2 squared is 4 times 2 is 8. That becomes a plus 2 minus 12. Gives me a negative 2. And then we need to find g of negative 2 also. So negative 2 plus 7 gives me a 5. So then we're going to take negative 2 plus 5 and get 3. So that is my answer, is 3. So f plus g of negative 2 is 3. And then number 9, we want to multiply f times g, but we want to do it of negative 1. So we're going to plug in f of negative 1. So 2 times negative 1 squared minus a negative 1 minus 12. So I get 2 times negative 1 squared gives me 2. Plus 1 minus 12 gives me a negative 9. And then I want to do g of negative 1. So I have negative 1 plus 7. 7 plus negative 1 gives me a 6. So then I'm going to multiply these two numbers together. So negative 9 times 6 gives me a negative 54. So my answer to this one is negative 54. You would do the same thing, same idea with subtraction and division. Number 8 and 10. So that's a way of combining functions using basic operations that we're already aware of.